Hello everyone, Professor Cruzluck here. So I wanted to make a couple videos about authoritarian regimes, some different aspects of authoritarianism, just so we are all on the same page understanding what is an authoritarian regime, life under authoritarianism, and then maybe why they persist the way they do, how autocrats maintain power. So maybe before taking a course on comparative politics, when we think about or we thought about different political systems, maybe we've divided the world simply into democracies and non-democracies. That simple distinction, though, hides a greater complexity of the way that regimes exist today. So when we look at Freedom House, if we look at Freedom House Index, we see that they go all the way from -1, the Russian occupied territory of Ukraine, all the way up to 100, the Scandinavian countries receiving the highest Freedom House scores. So we see that democracy, authoritarianism is on a spectrum. So when we just think about autocracy versus democracy, we hide quite a bit of complexity in the different governments that exist around the world, different states that exist around the world. So today's a couple of videos on authoritarianism. So just at the outset, authoritarianism is really a form of government in which political power is concentrated in the hands of a leader or small elites. Characterized by citizens lacking any meaningful mechanisms to hold rulers accountable. At its core, authoritarianism is defined as limited political pluralism. So people exist, organizations may exist, even elections may exist, but genuine competition for power does not exist. Leaders often rule without facing the real possibility of losing power. Leaders rule without the possibility of being voted out. They're not going to be removed by independent courts or constrained by independent legislatures. So this is what separates authoritarian systems from democratic ones. This idea of accountability to the voters, accountability to the courts, and accountability to the legislatures. As we talked about, in democracies, leaders can lose elections, be challenged by courts, criticized and held accountable by the media, and pressured by organized citizens. In authoritarian systems, those pathways are closed, weakened, or tightly managed. But authoritarianism is, as we said at the outset, not one single model, one single idea. It exists on this spectrum, ranging from relatively soft systems that allow some limited freedoms to highly repressive regimes where surveillance, imprisonment, and violence shape the daily lives of citizens. So understanding this spectrum is essential for understanding authoritarianism. Some authoritarian regimes tolerate controlled opposition and partial media. Others rely on mass repression, crackdowns of civil society, crackdowns on media. Most fall, though, somewhere in between. Political scientists therefore ask not simply whether a country is authoritarian or is a country democratic, but instead how authoritarian it is. Just like we talked about when political scientists talk about how democratic is the state. So let's begin by examining some of the core characteristics of an authoritarian regime. So, as we talked about in class and our textbook lays out, the defining feature of authoritarianism is the concentration in the centralization of authority. Power is typically concentrated in maybe a single leader, like a personalistic regime. As we talked about, Timothy Fry characterizes Russia as a personalistic regime, a single leader in charge. Maybe a dominant political party, a one party state. Our textbook uses China as the example. The military, often considered a junta rule. So the military controls the state, or maybe a small rolling coalition of groups, a small grouping of people who hold the power. So, unlike democracies, where authority is distributed across institutions, these authoritarian systems are designed to minimize uncertainty. Leaders seek to eliminate risks, especially the risk of losing power. Legislatures become rubber stamps, doing what those in power want, doing what the executive wants. Courts lose their independence. Bureaucracies answer upward to political leaders rather than outward to citizens. So, this concentration of power and authority allows rapid decision making, but it also removes safeguards against abuse from the leaders. So, once power becomes centralized, reversing that process has proven to be extremely difficult. So, let's think. Authoritarian regimes, a hallmark is that they do not permit genuine political competition. Some still hold elections. As we've talked about over the past week, there are still elections in authoritarian regimes. But those elections are typically structured to guarantee victory for those in power. So, this can involve disqualifying opposition candidates. As we talked about with a couple examples, leaders can fabricate claims against opposition leaders. We used the example of Alexei Navalny in Russia. The Kremlin fabricated claims against Navalny to disqualify him from being able to run. Manipulated district boundaries. Gerrymandering is a tool used to take away from free and fair elections. Restricting campaign finance, making sure your opposition doesn't have the funding to run an election. Intimidating voters. We talked about a couple different ways that voters can be intimidated. Maybe it's the military at polling stations. Maybe it's the military surrounding or the police force surrounding polling stations, intimidating voters. We also see that autocrats use state resources for rolling party campaigns in a way that the opposition doesn't have access to these resources. So these opposition parties may technically exist, but they operate at a significant advantage. Maybe they can't get their message on television. Maybe they don't have state resources. Maybe the resources that they could receive, people are hesitant to donate to because of political ramifications. So again, these political parties, these opposition parties exist, but they are working at a significant disadvantage. So this is why the political scientists emphasize that elections alone do not make a system democratic. When we talked about democracies, just having elections doesn't make you a democracy. We see elections in autocratic systems. Without fair roles and equal competition, elections become tools of legitimization rather than accountability like you need in a democracy. So authoritarian elections do serve an important role, though. They serve an important purpose. They provide leaders with claims of popular support while kind of preventing meaningful challenges. They're not going to get voted out, but they can say, oh, I am popular. We have this legitimacy. On the domestic side, we have legitimacy, and to the international community, who maybe you're hoping to get some foreign direct investment from, you have legitimacy. So moving beyond elections, we can think about civil liberties in an authoritarian regime. Another hallmark of authoritarianism is the erosion of civil liberties. These include the erosion of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and freedom of association. Citizens may retain rights on paper. They may be spelled out in the Constitution. Russia has a constitution that looks very similar to the US's. So the rights are spelled out in the Constitution, but exercising them carries increasing risks. Protests may require permits that are rarely granted, and then if you protest anyway, you're breaking the law. Journalists face lawsuits, they might face harassment. In the most extreme cases, they might face being killed. Activities are monitored. Universities are pressured, civil society is pressured to act in certain ways, and online spaces are surveilled. So the goal is rarely for autocrats to create total silence. Instead, authoritarian systems aim to produce self-censorship, an environment where people internalize limits and avoid political engagement because the costs are too high. Over time, this changes political culture itself. People are afraid to speak out. People are afraid to say the wrong thing because the regime might push back against them. They're afraid to lose their job. So we know that authoritarians devote enormous effort to shape what people see and hear. So this includes state-controlled media, regulatory pressure on independent outlets, internet censorship, blocking certain sites, blocking certain topics, slowing certain sites down, propaganda campaigns, and of course strategic disinformation. So modern authoritarianism does not rely solely on crude lies. Instead, it oftentimes floods the information environment with conflicting narratives. This makes it difficult to distinguish truth from facts. People are just overwhelmed with information, overwhelmed with disinformation. So even if the truth exists, they are so overwhelmed with the non-truths, they simply do not know what to believe. So this leads to, and this creates, a high level of cynicism. Citizens just stop believing anyone. Political accountability becomes harder. So this control of information is one of the most powerful tools authoritarians possess today to control what people think and how people feel about the regime. So one of the most important things for students of comparative politics to think about is that authoritarianism is not binary. Some regimes are brutally repressive. They use political prisoners. They ban opposition parties, constant surveillance, which creates widespread fear among the population. Others allow limited freedoms, controlled elections, or semi-independent institutions. Political scientists often describe these intermediate systems as hybrid regimes, countries that combine, remember we talked about with democracies, democratic procedures with authoritarian practices. These systems are especially important because they show how authoritarianism can emerge gradually without dramatic capture. Remember, we used Turkey as an example. We talked about Turkey, the slow erosion of democratic norms, the emergence of authoritarianism, slowly, not quickly, overnight. So we know in hybrid regimes, courts can still exist, elections still occur, the media still operates, but power is increasingly centralized, competition increasingly unfair, and dissent increasingly costly. This gradualism makes authoritarianism harder to detect and easier to normalize. So let's think about what life looks like under authoritarianism. And we can ask ourselves, what does authoritarianism feel like from inside? For many citizens, daily life appears relatively and pretty normal. People still work, they study, they raise family, they socialize with friends. Repression is often selective rather than universal. But politically, life is constrained. People learn what topics are safe and which are dangerous. They avoid criticizing leaders publicly. They assume phones may be monitored, their social media may be monitored. They hesitate before attending protests or even signing petitions against those in power. Participation becomes passive rather than active. Instead of seeing themselves as political agents, citizens adapt, comply, or simply withdraw and do not participate in the political process or in civil society. Trust absolutely erodes, not only in government, but also in neighbors and institutions. Fear often comes not from visible violence or jackbooted thugs on the street, but from the uncertainty, not knowing where the boundaries lie of what is acceptable versus not acceptable. So over time, people internalize these limits and check out of politics. So if life for average people probably remains the same. Again, in the most authoritarian states, this might be different, and this is on a spectrum. You stay out of politics in a place like Russia, and you don't protest, and your life is probably not. Your engagement with the state isn't that extreme. So let's think about then how authoritarian systems survive. They survive and they maintain power through a mix of repression, co-optation, and legitimacy. So I'll make another video with a little bit more detail about all of these, but just here at the outset, when we're thinking about characteristics of an authoritarian regime, repression. Repression includes surveillance, policing, arrests, legal penalties, and of course, sometimes the use of violence. Co-optation involves rewarding local elites. This might be business leaders, regional officials, security forces. You reward them with jobs, with contracts, or with political protection. Legitimacy, which we talked about when it was related to democracy as being important, legitimacy is cultivated through nationalism, economic performance, identity politics, or promises of stability. Leaders present themselves as protectors against chaos, against corruption, or foreign threats. We certainly see this when it comes to military juntas and how they say why they overthrew the previous regime and why they now say they should be in charge. Most authoritarian regimes rely on all three of these practices. Importantly, repression alone does not and only rarely sustains authoritarianism. Durable systems also work hard to shape beliefs, expectations, and norms. So students may be asking, why do people tolerate authoritarian rule? Sure, maybe your daily life isn't that impacted, but if you don't have political rights, why do people tolerate this authoritarian role? The answer lies largely in risks, in coordination problems, and of course, uncertainty of what might be next. Challenging authoritarian governments, we can imagine, is dangerous. People don't know who else will join. Security forces, the police, may respond violently. Economic consequences can be quite severe. Governments exploit these fears by fragmenting opposition, isolating citizens from one another, and preventing and working towards the prevention of collective action. So even when dissatisfaction is widespread, when there are grievances in society, mobilization is quite difficult. So today, authoritarianism is not disappearing. It is not on its back foot. It is not on its way out. In many places, it is becoming more consolidated and more sophisticated. Modern authoritarian regimes use law, technology, and institutions rather than mass terror alone that maybe we saw 50 years ago. Autocracies today versus how they used to control society. Today they hold elections, they still have courts, you can see the court buildings. Autocrats speak the language of democracy. If we turn on a Vladimir Putin speech, he talks about democracy and the importance of democracy. So autocrats use these words, have these buildings, have these institutions, even as they hollow these institutions out. So political scientists increasingly study authoritarian and how they learn from each other. Regimes copy strategies from one another, sharing surveillance technologies and refining techniques of control. The big takeaway there is that authoritarianism is evolving. So, understanding authoritarianism matters because it reveals what happens when accountability disappears. Authoritarian systems show how political power becomes insulated from public pressure, how institutions are shaped or reshaped to serve rulers or the party or a small grouping of rulers, and how citizens gradually lose meaningful voice. They also remind us that democracy is not automatic or permanent. Authoritarianism is not simply the absence of democracy. It is a political system with its own logic, tools, and survival strategies. Recognizing these patterns helps us understand global politics and the stakes of democratic erosion. Okay, thank you for watching our introductory video on authoritarian regimes. Thank you.